Hello, good afternoon. I hope you're all well, and I hope you've really enjoyed the final day of the conference as much as I have. I'm really privileged to be able to chair this final session for the day. And as you can see, the presenters are also here with us. I'm going to not waste any more of our precious time in chatting, and I will get straight into it. So I'm going to call on Sophie and Linda to speak first. And Sue, sorry, is Sue here? No, Sophie and Linda. And I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. Okay, well, I'm Linda McKie from the University of Edinburgh, and together with Sophie Bowlby from the University of Reading, we're offering this short presentation this afternoon. And given that we need to be short, we're really keen to get comments and ideas either this afternoon or after today by email. Because for us, this is a moment in time when we've begun to rethink some 20 years of work on care and different dimensions of care. And so the paper is called Revitalising Sociological Perspectives on Care, an Ecological Approach. And we'd like to explain how we've arrived at this ecological approach. We're not wholeheartedly wedded to it. It may be a stopping off point on our journey in terms of work around care, but certainly something we're keen to explore and get ideas and comments on. So a little bit about the background of how we've got here. So why an ecology of care? Well, first off, should I say that when we talk about an ecology of care, we're talking about ways of thinking, of relevance to the analysis of differing standpoints or unique experiences in terms of care. And we've got to this moment in time after a couple of decades of developing work around caringscapes and carescapes, which is on the slide here today. Now, for us, caringscapes is about bringing together social and cultural geographies with sociology to look at care in terms of time and space, the temporal and spatial perspectives on it, to look at the ways in which we bring our own experiences, our histories, our memories, our anticipations, and within that time space, how we reflect on past, present, and future, how we think about care in a very fluid and dynamic way. We think about care in a very fluid and dynamic way, and sometimes we come into contact with carescapes, which are much more about the socio-material context of care. This is the resources and the services, the procedures and regulations, and the material resources. So, for example, our caringscape might be that we anticipate, we begin to think, perhaps as we get into the second half of our lives, what caring might be like for ourselves or for our parents. The carescape that we encounter is the availability and sometimes the non-availability of domiciliary or residential care. And I think that gives us just a small example in the time that we've got of how those carescapes interact with our caringscapes. Our work has been very much about the formal and the informal, the paid and the unpaid care. It's been about the intersectionalities, all too evident in the way in which care is experienced and the ways in which care deficits become very obvious. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted that in the last year. We can see how care remains invisible in many ways, even though it's been absolutely critical during the pandemic. And I think it's interesting that we talk about care recovery plans as the Women's Budget Group does, and yet it still seems to be very far away from any particular political party stance or any particular policy, albeit I should note, sitting in Scotland, that perhaps we have some debates going on here around a national care service, which might well begin to look at how caringscapes and carescapes interact. So to move on, why did we arrive at this notion of ecologies of care? Well, I think we became very aware that care was often viewed as a complex morass by policymakers and providers. And within social sciences, it's often very much taken for granted. And we'll come back to the theorization, or perhaps the inadequate theorization of care, in a moment. And we began to look at this because it's become quite fashionable in many ways to think about ecologies around climate and environment. And we began to think about the potential for this particular framework to help thinking around care. So the popular uses of social ecology are really around perhaps health promotion. And I'm going to move on to a diagram where I think you possibly might have seen some of these diagrams in public health or health promotion, where people talk about these kind of nested systems. And the popular uses of social ecology have come in for quite notable criticisms, and we ourselves would not wish to go down this model, because you can see that it suggests a nested system and suggests ways in which these circles might well interact, which are perhaps too static, although we've got all the arrows going on there. And we felt that perhaps there was insufficient attention being paid to inequalities in terms of power and various forms of intersectionality. So moving on, we moved into the world of complex systems. And about 18 months ago, Sylvia Bowlby shared with us a new theorization of society. And we actually don't get many new theorizations of society as a complex entity. So good for her for putting this out there. She shared with us her approach to different domains of social relations: economy, polity, civil society, and violence. Sets of social relations of inequality are evident in her work in terms of gender, race, class, etc. And each of these domains and sets can have a different spatial and temporal reach. So in our work, thinking about care and thinking about the relationship between the experiences of care and the policies of care, we kind of thought, oh, this might give us a way forward. However, you'll notice that there's one word missing when we describe Sylvia's system, the domains and the sets, and that in fact is care. So in terms of thinking about social systems, can we then argue for the inclusion of a domain of care? Care is omnipresent. We can't go through life without giving or receiving care, without hoping for care, without anticipating the emotional labor or the intimacy that comes from care, about the very need for care in a very kind of visceral sense. So we then thought to ourselves, okay, can we begin to think about socio-material features of this domain? And one feature where we might think about ecologies and systems was around the infrastructures of care. And here I'm going to pass to Sophie, who's going to take forward some of our suggestions. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks, Linda. I hope you can move on to the next slide, right? So this notion of infrastructures of care actually was mentioned at the conference yesterday. And I want to particularly use a particular idea of thinking about these, which was suggested by Emma Power and others. They were talking actually about housing as an infrastructure of care. Particularly, of course, you can think of things like care services as residential care homes, care workers, all of that kind of thing as an infrastructure of care. But one of the things that interested me and Linda particularly, and Sue, particularly in Emma Power's ideas, is that it's stressing that a lot of things that we use for care are not thought of as actually being directed at care. So in this conception, infrastructure of care include both material entities, such as houses or ambulances, but very importantly, also the institutional arrangements and the social arrangements, the discourses, all the sets of bureaucracies and ideas that inform how a particular infrastructure works. And Emma Power argues that infrastructures of care are particularly important to our capacity to care. And she's arguing this in the context of housing, pointing out how different sorts of housing can facilitate or very much hinder the capacity to care. And I think we should extend this idea. So, I mean, the pictures there up in the top right-hand corner sort of is an illustration of how very different kind of housing that you might get and how different the experience of caring in these different material constructions might be. But I want to get away from just the idea that it's a physical thing. It's also about, in the case of housing, for example, the precarity of the housing, the tenure structures, the way in which you own or fail to own that house. So it's about much more than the actual physical structure, but that's also a very important part of it. So shelter is a particularly obvious feature that is very important to care. But so also is food and the provision of food. And the two pictures there are a sort of reminder that in our culture, we have a system of food provision that in the West, in the minority world, provides us with an enormous range of choice in supermarkets and so forth, but also leads many people to have no choice and minimal access to food, as the food bank picture suggests as well. And another feature which is very important to care is infrastructure that's important to care is mobility, the ability to visit somebody to care for them, to move around to care for yourself, to go and collect that food, see other people. And mobility, again, is something which in the minority world is very much directed at individual abilities to move. And in the picture, there's a car. And the other picture, in fact, is of somebody helping a woman with rather limited physical mobility to go and get into a community transport vehicle. So, you know, it's care in terms of a system of transport, but care also between the person, the driver, in this case, helping her. And a fourth, infrastructure of care, which is very important, is that of communication. The ability to talk to people, to offer care verbally, to ask for care, and to explain our needs and our feelings is very important. And as we all know, today, the kind of infrastructure that we have in social media is perhaps not entirely formed around the idea of facilitating care. Indeed, it often facilitates hate. But again, we have very important inequalities in access to those means of care. And finally, perhaps healthcare is an obvious thing that we would normally include in infrastructures of care. But I think, again, it's the contrast between the high-tech care and the personal care that is needed. So one of the things we felt would be very important is to consider is how those social material infrastructures of care are structured in different situations and how they affect the capacity to care. A different set of infrastructures might be relevant in a different situation. Okay, so moving on then, having just offered a few of our suggestions and where we're at, as Linda said, this is an evolving kind of approach. Why have we turned to complexity theory, and why do we think that this might be, in conjunction with the idea of an ecology, a useful way forward? Some of the advantages that we think exist are, first of all, the flexibility. One of the things about ecological approaches is that, as it said on a previous slide, any element takes all other elements as its environment. So you can decide what it is you want to focus on. It could be the very small scale, for example, the care within a hospital ward or within a nursery, or it might be a very big scale. It might be the provision for, say, children in care in the EU. How is that to look at that sort of system? So it offers you a great deal of flexibility about scale, but also about the types of care that you might be looking at. You choose your focus, and of course the job of any empirical researcher is then to think about what are the relevant infrastructures of care, what are the relevant intersectional inequalities that are important. Because secondly, I think one of the things that particularly we liked about Bowlby's approach was the emphasis on intersectionalized inequalities and a way of thinking about that, because that does seem so self-evidently important in care relationships or relationships of neglect. And another reason for particularly focusing on the social material infrastructure is to get away from just hoping that people will be nice. It's not just about good individuals, it's about the socio-material infrastructure within which people try to care. So I think it does offer perhaps a way forward to think about the complexity of relations of care. And the other very strong advantage perhaps of complexity theory is it expects unexpected outcomes, including perhaps, I don't know whether you can hear that I'm in the middle of a rainstorm, but it's hard to hear. So if we just move on to the last slide. So we thought we'd just leave, you know, as Linda already stressed, we're not wedded to this. We're very happy to receive criticisms and thoughts of different ways to go. But out of what we've said so far, one of the things that I think is very important in policy terms is to think about not simply how do we get people to value care, which we've been talking about for a million years, but also how can we get people to recognize the value of infrastructures of care and to think of them in terms of care, to think that that's one of the most important things that they offer, and to structure them in a way that improves care. Okay, I'll stop there and thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sophie and Linda. That was brilliant. Really, really interesting. And it is amazing, isn't it, to think that you know, we sometimes get stuck into you know, conceptualization that we've really engaged with, and thinking about things from a new perspective, for a new conceptualization, can really give deeper insights into something that we think we know. Thank you for that. If I could call on Nadya, Nadya Guimaraes from the University of Sao Paulo.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening in different countries. It's a pleasure to be here. To be fast, I'll try to share my... thank you. My presentation will be based upon mostly a chapter recently published in the book on care and care workers, a Latin American perspective, that came out by Springer this year. And some departure point, it's true that care studies is has been a prolific and challenging field, and that it encompasses the substantive traditions and various disciplinary frameworks. And this makes this domain really interesting, and the previous presentation is a challenge on this frontiers of exploring frameworks. My point is that although we have a growing comparative investment on care studies, they have been mostly north-north studies, sometimes including north-south comparisons. So in my view, we have some urgent goals in order to capture tendencies and improve analytical goals. First, I think it's interesting to improve systematic comparison South-South, either intra-Latin American, as we did in the book, and beyond. But those comparisons are very important to better sustain South-North comparative advances in a way that we can understand new theoretical developments put into place in the South, aimed at capturing specificities and enriching interpretations on care. So my presentation, I'll be selecting some stylized facts on the Brazilian case to stimulate our discussion in terms of these frontiers that explore specific features on social organization of care in the South that can be relevant for theorizing care and overall care work, which is my privileged prism in my So the first stylized fact is something we have been hearing and writing about for a long time. This is a dispressive growth in female labor force engagement. That in this figure, I try to capture it comparing from one side, some most developed countries, and I took France, United Kingdom, United States, in some less developed countries, and I took Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. What is interesting, from 1960s to 2010, those are census data, we have this impressive move that made close the intensity of female engagement in the labor market, joining less developed and more developed countries. The Brazilian case is a remarkable one. This is this black line. We came from less 2 up to 10 women in the labor force in the 60s to almost 6 in the 2010, getting closer, really closer to the experience of most developed countries. The other stylized fact that comes in our mind is aging. This is a comparison between the patterns and the perspectives of aging in France, Brazil, and Japan. And you can see the Brazilian figure in this pink line as compared with the France line and the Japan line. Besides engagement and aging, taking into account this new scenario and coming from the Brazilian case, we have a really intriguing novelty that arrives in our labor market. And this novelty can be captured by naming, by the way new characters appears in the labor market relations, named in the new way. It's interesting, in this graph, I try to follow from late 19th century to nowadays, the way a new word appears in the Brazilian press. This new word is care worker, cuidadora, which is the same word in Portuguese and Spanish. We can see that this is an almost inexistent word that came to the social scene in the 2000s and became very important in terms of references. My point is that there is a new reality in this reframed social structure. The fourth stylized fact is that this new character in the labor market, this new occupation that appears in the statistics, is impressively important for the social organization of households in Brazil. In this graph, we can see from 2012 to 2019, each semester, the rhythm of growth in the employment rates of care workers, compared with the median in the labor force and compared with domestic employees. What is amazing is that the more we get into an economic crisis, the faster the growth in care work occupations appears in this graph. I mean, it became a sort of imperative in the household organization for those who can pay, who can go to the market in order to get private household care. This is interesting because it goes side by side with a specificity which is particularly relevant in the South, and it's important in some countries in the South. This picture is from an ILO report from 2018, where different types of care regime, if we use the concept, are pictured, showing the difference in the way care work, domestic work, professional care, non-professional care relates and organize care in different countries. Those, I just called your attention for those light blue countries, which are mostly South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia, Venezuela. Those countries are the most important in the world where care provision is strongly based on domestic employment, not necessarily on professional care work. With this last stylized fact, I come to my point. When we take a societal perspective, and if we observe care relations from the perspective of South countries, and I want to stress, very unequal, with strong levels of poverty, of course, there is a move toward commodification of care, of providing care as a profession, where there is work is recognized as care work, and this is a professional activity. This is the case of nursing occupations. This is the case where work, care, and professional assignation go together. This is also the case of care workers, domestic care workers, where they ask for recognition on her activities as professional activities, on care, commodified work. And this is also the case of domestic employees, which are never recognized in our statistics as care workers. In the Brazilian case, they took part of another family of occupations, and they dispute recognition as care workers. The more care workers appear in Brazilian scene, and this is also the case in other Latin American countries, the more they stress the distance they have vis-a-vis domestic employees. They are not regular domestic employees. They are special professions. Although they have no professional recognition, although they have no, in the Brazilian case, professional rights and occupational rights, workers' rights assigned, they ask this condition of care workers, of professionals of care. This is part of a move, commodification of care, that runs, if we think in terms of social infrastructures of care, trying to make a link with the previous presentation, which runs very clearly for middle and upper class. And if we take those emic names, if we take those emic names, enfermeiras, nursings, domestics, domestic employees, cuidadoras, care workers, there is a naming dispute There are different strategies of social recognitions and access to formal rights. In the Brazilian case, when cuidadoras came to the scene requiring for rights, enfermeiras, nurses said, no, care is something we do. And we do since doctors, they cure and we care. And professional recognitions for nurses stand over those characteristics. They provide care. How can some women that had no medium education or third degree education ask for this condition of professionals in care? Cuidadoras, from other side, they have a naming dispute with domestic employee. They never want to be labeled as domesticas, although they are also in the household, although they are also in the domestic space. So as far as market is important, that dimension of care as a profession comes to the front of the scene. But there is another set of invisible work and invisible workers for whom care is not a profession, is an obligation. Even though it's the same concrete activity, no? I provide and I feed an elderly person, or I feed a baby. It can be the same particular concrete activity, but it is signified, its meaning differs. If I do this as a nanny, domestic worker profession, or if I do this as a mother, doing care as an obligation. In this case, there is work, but there is not a profession. There is care, and there is not retribution in monetary terms, but retribution is in terms of love, because the meaning is that there is an obligation based on love relations. Finally, and this is really interesting for in countries like Brazil, where huge poverty and huge inequalities are into place. There is a third meaning for care, which I labeled as help. In this case, important care relations, care provision, overall among very poor people that cannot pay for care in the market, but they are not part of the state provision of care, since the state is very fragile on care provision. They solve their care provision problems by asking for help, exchanging help actions, by reciprocity relations that are framed neither as care nor as work, but emic as help. They are neighbors, they are friends, there is a network of, in emic terms, vizinhas, amigas, which in network provide each one to the other care help. This is important, especially for poor women when they go to work and they don't have nursery to either help for taking care of her children, or have this kind of service, but inadequate lapse of time that do not fit with their labor journeys. So to close, trying to think these different ways of shaping the notion of care in emic terms, I arrived to the utility of a concept like circuit. With the idea of circuit, I would like to emphasize first connections, linkages, as well as flows. I mean, social connectivity. Circuit of care in this perspective is overall a product of a sort of relational work. In relational work, I use here not just in the common sense of there are relationships required in doing any kind of work. It's not this, precisely. I took from Zelizer the idea that relational work is the kind of work that involves systematic effort to differentiate meaningful social relations. So, in my point of view, when we go back to these three blocks of profession, obligation, and help, and inside the block of care as a profession, we realize that dispute between nurses, domestic employees, and care worker, domestic care workers, in fact, we are facing effort from each group to differentiate meaningful social relations and thus place themselves in this complex world of care provision. In the sense, a circuit could be defined by the confluence of a certain modality of social relation of care, characterized by certain meanings attributed to them. Depending on the meaning, feeding an elder can be totally different if there is a care worker or if it is a daughter or if it is a spouse that is feeding this elder, which correspond to certain economic transactions, can be commodified relation in certain ways of payment that can be monetary or not, and that can include different types of currencies, and that can include different ways of valuing how to pay. When we observe.
So sorry to interrupt, Nadya. I'm afraid that we're a bit short on time. Don't
just
stop. But we yes, please. Thank you so much.
Just closing. What is then the advantage of analyzing the care work from the notion of circuits? I think this notion can help us to organize this patchwork of heterogeneous situations, since the same set of concrete activities occur under different social relationships. Thus, under the guise of the same job aimed at producing or restoring the well-being of someone, there are often differences and disputes in meaning which support different types of social ties and distinct work relations. That is the crucial argument I would like to make, and I stop here and will be happy to receive comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadya. That was brilliant. I think I was really bowled over, and I can see from Twitter and whatnot that many other people were bowled over when you tracked the growth of the term care worker. It's reflected in my context as well. So really interesting historical contextualizing. I'd like to ask Allison if you're ready now. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you all, and I really enjoyed those presentations so far, so I'm looking forward to an active Q&A session. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in. Care work scholars, in my view, have been confounded by the question of how to talk about emotions. Many researchers seem to view emotions as either attachment or love. For example, when paid caregivers or recipients feel love or affection for the other in an ongoing relationship, or emotional labor, i.e. when people manage their emotions to produce the right feeling in themselves and others, as Hochschild defined. Yet these two paradigms are at the heart of well-founded critiques by critical race scholars and disability scholars. And today I'm going to consider the way care work scholarship analyzes emotions and also these critiques before I introduce a concept that has emerged from my ongoing book project, which is based on 100 interviews, more than 100 interviews and more than 300 hours of observation with people engaged in humane paid work. And as this is ongoing, I also, as others have said, look forward to your comments now or by email. You can see my email address right there. So attachment. Some care work scholars point to attachment as an integral part of care. And for example, Kanchan and Oliker define caregiving as, quote, feelings of affection and responsibility combined with actions that provide responsively for an individual's personal needs or well-being in a face-to-face relationship, end quote. But the issue here is not whether caregivers feel affection and love for their clients and patients, since such feelings often, but not always, arise in care situations. Instead, it is how central those feelings are to the work. Does their care count as care, regardless of their personal attachment to the care recipient? So you have on the one hand attachment, on the other hand we have emotional labor. And for most care work scholars, if emotion in care is not attachment, it's emotional labor. So as a normative area replete with dictates about who ought to care and how they ought to do it, there are plenty of shoulds in care work, and this includes how people should feel, making emotional labor an apt line of inquiry. But the reign of attachment and emotional labor as paradigms governing how care scholars talk about feeling have led researchers to focus on questions like on issues like the presence or the purity of that feeling, such as motivation, authenticity, alienation. For example, researchers identified a prisoner of love framework in which the intimate and the intrinsic rewards of altruism bind caregivers to jobs that are, undercompensated and, problems. These long-standing areas of research have come under some criticism of late, however, leading some to advocate that we leave emotions aside altogether. I can see that I'm not giving you my screen. So here's the first screen where I discuss, here we have, kind of two paradigms. Now the critiques. So even though care work scholarship was inspired from the beginning by concerns about inequality, like to bring attention to an enterprise that was undervalued, invisible, and mostly performed by women, critical race scholars and disability scholars have critiqued existing care work research for three failings that actually serve to amplify, they argue, intersectional inequalities of race, class, gender, and ability. And at the heart of these critiques has been the treatment of emotions. So critique number one is that emotions research de-skills or depoliticizes care. Oh, forgive me, you probably can hear this. I'm living in New York City right now, and there's an ice cream truck passing by. Okay, so scholars take issue with the centrality of sentiment in care work scholarship, or what Raka-Ray and Seaman Kuyum have dubbed love rhetoric. That's language that's kind of draped over the relations among domestic workers, the people they care for, and their employers. And they say such rhetoric can make those relations meaningful, as they find among workers in India. But care workers pay a heavy price for that language. And Romero and Perez really itemized some of those costs that those workers pay. They noted that love rhetoric obscures the skill involved in care work, suppresses recognition of care as a collective responsibility, justifies the exclusion of care work from labor regulation, enables exploitation and abuse, and blurs, this is a quote, the intersectional issues of inequality in the labor and focuses solely on gender, thereby obscuring how their labor also helps to forge race, class, and gender inequalities. So in this argument, emotions defang care work of its capacities to address its intersectional inequalities. So critique number two says that emotions research reinscribes racialized divisions of care work. Care work scholars have engaged in definitional debates since the inception of the field. So some have sought distinctions between face-to-face work and caring support, such as cleaning. So they say there's nurturant and non-nurturant care, or nurturant direct care and reproductive labor, or non-practical relational work and practical tasks. All these definitional dilemmas that they try and solve. Yet while scholars have used these distinctions often to analyze race and class-based job segregation or pay gaps, etc., critics have argued that these categories themselves foster inequality among women. Distinctions between work that involve face-to-face nurture and that involve backstage support sound impartial, but they are far from race and class neutral, as Roberts has contended. They follow the separation of spiritual and menial labor, or dirty work, that once characterized the unpaid work of privileged white women as housewives, and the domestic labor done by non-white immigrant and working class women. And furthermore, these categories don't actually reflect actual distinctions in the field, these scholars note, because care jobs often resist such neat categorization, mixing cleaning and interacting, or cooking and nurture, etc. Critique number 3 is that emotions research hides the mutuality of care. Disability activists critique visions of care work that rely on emotions as a conduit for that care, arguing that these models offer a personalized, patronizing form of care located in the private sphere that portrays disabled people as victims of personal tragedy, in contrast to the caregiver's heroism. And scholars also argue that care receivers are diminished when care is defined on the basis of the abilities of the client or recipient, specifically whether or not they are able to provide for themselves, as some have distinguished between, quote, necessary care and personal service, or dependency work and domestic labor. On the one hand, these distinctions are important for policy considerations, since society has an interest in subsidizing care that satisfies basic needs that are otherwise unmet. But critical disability researchers have advocated a turn to the personal assistance model, instead considering care with its emotional emphasis conceptually contaminated. So these 3 critiques have led some scholars to disavow the role of emotions in care work entirely, to urge care work researchers to de-emphasize emotions in their analyses, and to prioritize other framings that they argue are better able to incorporate the intersectional politics of care work. Emotions, in this view, are the problem. But I argue that the problem here is stemming in large part from the limited ways in which we are conceiving of emotions and also deploying them, primarily emotions in the guise of attachment. Attachment and the other paradigm, emotional management, crowd out other means of thinking about emotions at work. For instance, how they might be used skillfully as a tool, regardless of the purity of one's motive or authenticity of one's feeling. Rather than turning our gaze away from emotion, I contend that we can remedy, or at least kind of go towards addressing some of these problems by instead turning towards it, by complicating and deepening our reckoning of the emotional dimensions of care. And as part of this effort, I'm offering the term connective labor, which I'm defining as the creating and sharing of an emotional acknowledgement of another person through a process of seeing or reflecting them in order to create value. And connective labor is made up of 3 components: empathic listening, workers cultivating a shared emotional understanding of someone else's perspective; emotional management, because caregivers can't always just be letting loose with their own visceral reactions in the clinic or the classroom; and witnessing, so with which workers reflect back through words or actions what they see of the other person. And following Fisher and Toronto, these processes are interactive, in which the client, patient or student, etc., helps to co-construct the meaning of the encounter. And connective labor then is both skill and collaboration. It includes not just the worker's capacity to read the other, but also the collaboration between the worker and the client to create meaning out of their exchange. So introducing connective labor allows us to tackle some of the previous critiques. First, its specificity allows us to see it as both skill and collaboration. And I'm not going to go into this now for space reasons, timing reasons, but in my interviews and observations, I have witnessed active training of the capacity to see the other. Second, and paradoxically, connective labor disrupts some of those definitional distinctions that naturalized racial, ethnic, and class differences in those early definitional debates that are actually not early, they're still ongoing. So when we drill down into specific processes of care, rather than identifying, say, relational and nurturant jobs per se, we can identify work that involves more or less of these processes, And this move helps to clarify that components of some jobs that might not be identified as relational in their entirety still have this kind of component. So it decomposes some of these fixed racial ethnic binaries. It also allows us, and this is one of my favorite aspects, it allows us to see both advantage and disadvantage in care work. So for example, the low-income nursing aides or domestic workers who are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, and the paternalistic power that care workers have over vulnerable care recipients. And in my experience in the care literature, existing work often analyzes one or the other of these, but not really both at the same time. In particular, approaches that distinguish between necessary and unnecessary labor or care and personal services define that inequality out of the analytic window, and connective labor actually is a part of both of those. So in my own work, the book project from which this is drawn, I have interviewed practitioners on either end of the advantage spectrum, and I have found inequality has several effects on connective labor, and I'll tell you just about one. In one that I'll discuss today, it impedes it by silencing the less advantaged participant, either worker or client. It blocks the storytelling upon which it relies. Practitioners then find themselves having to do extra work to make up for this silencing, either if it's them silencing themselves or the client or recipient. And I have here an example from Gunika Nawani, who is a primary care physician, who said she tried to make space for what patients thought of her advice. Earlier in her career, she said she just lectured them about eating their vegetables. Now she says she understands more about how to invite them to tell her why they aren't. She says, if we don't get to the root cause, if we don't get to what's the barrier, we can't remove the barrier. And then, you know, I can tell them to eat vegetables forever and it won't ever happen. Other workers who feel themselves on the other side of advantage silence themselves, shaping the kind of mirroring or reflecting they can even provide. So Lee Simpson was a college student who worked as a waitress and intern, and also a sugar baby, which is an ill-defined role somewhere between being a paid companion and a sex worker. And she was explicit. Her sugar baby work was a performance, one matched to whatever the other wanted. So she said, I have to make sure this person feels like they're seen, like they're getting enough attention. I always want to hear what they're looking for first, because I like to tailor my responses around theirs. Finally, the arguments of disability activists who attempt to ward off paternalism by disavowing emotion entirely appear to presume love or attachment are the only dimensions of emotions in care work. But for connective labor, emotions are a tool. It's a means of sensing the contours of the other, their identity, desires, dislikes, without which the care recipient is standardized and the care work is uniform. In addition, feminists have decried the denigration of gendered emotional work, which characterizes even the work of these, quote, personal assistants. The denial of emotional content, scholars argue, is as much a disservice to the care recipient as it is to the caregiver. But I would say, most importantly, connective labor may be emotional, but that does not mean that it is necessarily one way. It's a mutual achievement, only accomplished with the shared acknowledgement of both parties. Collaboration helps to create the meaning of the encounter for both participants. So finally, I would say, I just recall that Mignon Duffy has argued that we need to be much more specific about the processes of care in order to make an argument for its value. When employers ignore it, they do not systematize it, which is often a fear about outlining its processes, but neither do they make time for that. And there's a lot of existing work that documents this. The naming of connective labor at the same time and its differentiation from those two other existing models should not, I think, preclude the kind of questions that have been raised in the past about the impact and the experience of these emotions. So, for example, how their caregiver working conditions shape the degree to which practitioners are alienated by the experience of deploying it for a wage. We can also investigate the impact of profit seeking and efficiency on people's efforts to achieve an emotional understanding of the other. That feels like very within a strong existing tradition regarding emotions in care work. But I think the term also opens up kind of new areas for research, how workers manage what Foucault called pastoral power and its tensions of kind of affirming another's uniqueness, but at the same time requiring their emotional legibility. Another kind of area is the factors that shape the mutual co-constitution of meaning in care work interactions. Again, how workers of varying advantage conduct and experience connective labor, the cultural scripts and contexts that generate recognition and misrecognition and their impact. This is, I think, some of the fertile areas that await researchers. Furthermore, I would argue there are many other kinds of emotions out there in care work as yet unidentified that could expand our ability to explore and understand it. We might agree upon an umbrella term. I would note that Hochschild's latest work, 30 years after The Managed Heart, urges us to use emotional labor in a much more expansive way beyond just emotional management, but also to kind of talk about, kind of just the use of emotions in this work. And maybe that can be our umbrella term. And then there's like attachment, emotional management, connective labor, and then other kinds of emotion that we have not explored here. So connective labor is not the whole of what is missing in care work, but its inclusion, I think, makes room for others to explore the terrain. And the point I want to say is not to turn away from emotion in care, but to complicate our understanding of it. Thank you very much.
Wow, Allison, that was wonderful. And I think that it's been such a theme of this conference, the way that emotion really informs our understanding of care, but also that there's really no comprehensive understanding of what that means or how that means, how that manifests itself in our care. And of course, that is really a mechanism of the fact that we're all individuals, and the care that we perform really is contextual. And it's a difficult thing to do, but nevertheless, we have to try. So I'm grateful to everyone in the panel. And I would just like to open the forum up for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I think there's one.
Oh, hang on, never mind. I'm missing Nikita. I'm so sorry, Nikita. I got excited. Can you hear me? Hi, Nikita. I'm so sorry. You're on mute.
Hi, Claire. I'm so sorry. It just kicked me out.
I'm so sorry, and I got overwhelmed for a moment as well. So I'm going to hand over to you.
No problem. Just bear with me a second. Well, thank you so much for your patience. And I'm absolutely privileged and humbled to be here at such an amazing event, and particularly at such a path-breaking panel. What I present here is of much more humble origins, a small slice of my PhD thesis, which focused on care burdens and mental distress amongst the Gadi tribal community of Kangra in Himachal Pradesh in northern India. For the women I worked with, care was both a life-affirming practice and a source of distress. Its flows were structured by patriarchal kinship systems and aspirations for upward social mobility. The strains of care were embodied in the biopsychosocial idiom of tension, were shifted across the life course. But what I want to begin with is a moment in my fieldwork that got me thinking about the modalities of informal care that exist within these patriarchal kinship structures and actually provide relief for women. So this moment occurred, and here's a picture actually of it that I took when I was there, on a bright day when I was invited to the birthday party of a dear friend, Vandana, in her natal home. Vandana ushered me around to the back of the house after the party was over and into a room that was full of women sitting together under the razai or blanket. These women were of all ages. They were breastfeeding, they were pregnant, they were elderly, they were widows, and they came from near and far to this function. These women were speaking of the sukh-dukh of life, the ups and downs. And they shared with me the importance of sharing, of unburdening their hearts in order to ease their tension. I was really struck by this moment because usually women in this community keep to themselves. They had a saying, apne ghar, apne tension, to each their house, to each their stress. And they were very clear about the need to keep the boundaries of these houses in order to maintain respectability. So this moment of sharing provoked three questions for me. What kind of relief did women get from this modality of care? What structural circumstances and symbolic languages made these acts of telling possible and effectual? And to what extent can we identify and build on these alternative spaces of care in order to build social infrastructures? So my methodological goal during this thesis was to track the emergence of distress across this community as it ran along the lines of caste, class, and tribal inequality, and as it changed across the gendered life course, in order to develop a relational theory of tension. Hence, tracing relationships of care or developing a cartography of care relations was both the means and the ends of my methodology. And I worked on this in 3 phases over 15 months. So the first phase involved a household and health survey where I measured and tried to understand the density of care relationships within and between households and the forms of somatic and mental distress that women expressed within these situations. Secondly, I conducted classical kinship mapping in a sample of households across different castes. And this really allowed me to get to the deep historical perspectives on life histories and migration narratives, as well as relationships of kinship, marriage, and exchange. I conducted women's interviews across the community, particularly in liminal stages of life, like pregnancy and widowhood, and workshops with women of different generations. I moored this then in archival research, reaching back to the colonial period to try and understand how these structures had changed. So what did this yield? What emerged was an emic theory of care as part of women's ethical work or calm, a moral duty that cultivated respectability or ijat, and a form of exhausting physical labor. It involved a practical element of meeting needs and an emotional element of cultivating the appropriate affects. So here, emotion was really important to the care. But more importantly, it involved managing a web of worldly concerns that women called mormaya, that constituted the household and all the relationships within it. So the responsibilities for this web of Maya changed across the life course and were held in the woman's body, beginning in adolescence, peaking as a woman birthed her children and waning as she untangled herself from this web in old age. But the stakes for this web and maintaining its kind of what cleanliness, as women called the safe nature of these relationships, was higher now, where the project of domesticity has become part of the communal aspiration towards upward social mobility and inclusion in the Hindu middle class. When these relationships were off kilter or strained, women felt tension in their bodies as weakness, somatic symptoms, or various forms of affliction that I delineate in my thesis. But more importantly for us here today, I think the meaning and structure of care has changed really rapidly over the past century as this community moves from agropastoralism, being shepherds, to petty wage labor in tourism, hospitality, and slate mining. See, simultaneous to this political-economic shift that I identified particularly in the kinship mapping was changes to exchange in marriage practices from exchange or atta-satta marriage to hypergamous prestige marriage along lines of class. This was paralleled with a movement from a joint family or a large kind of sprawling domestic network to an increasingly nuclearized household unit underpinned by a romantic conjugal bond. So the result was a change in the position of women in the household and the resources of care that women had access to. Now, I saw this most clearly in the story of Skuntala, a dear friend of mine who was in her 70s. She'd been a shepherdess along the pastoral trail for most of her life. She'd married her husband about 40 years ago with her sister as well, where they both joined a large household and played a significant role in income generation through farming and shepherding. Labor in her household, she told me, was pooled across the different wives in this domestic network, even though there was sometimes friction between them. But she had mobility to move across the village as she cared for animals. There was stigma in returning to her natal home, except in situations of violence. Now, her daughters take on a very different role, where they take on a role of a housewife. They've withdrawn from work and are fairly enclosed within the home, yet they have stronger relationships with their husbands, and they laugh at, and Skuntala laughs at the fact that they're always fasting for them for festivals like Karva Chauth. Yet, her daughters are much more able to return to their natal home and draw on her support financially or emotionally in times of need. Now, this raises the fact that we see significant changes in the flows of social support and the permissibility of different forms of care in the past about half century. We see the nuclearization of the household, meaning women are more likely to seek support from the romantic partner and not their sisters-in-law. We see women fearing the gossip of their neighbors and keeping their tension to themselves in their marital community. Yet we see that women still have a really strong discourse of sharing, share karna parega, which means one must share, and dil ka boj utana, which means one must let go of the burden or unburden oneself from the heart. And these resources come more from their natal home than they did in previous times. I know this is a very small slice of life and a kind of small local situation, yet I think it has significant theoretical implications, where I'm arguing for the systemic mapping of kinship, changing kinship, marriage, and exchange patterns to understanding the structural and symbolic forms that care takes beyond topographies of formal care. And hence, I hope to contribute to recent literature in anthropology and geography on ecologies of care, like the brilliant paper we've heard today, by adding specific ways of acknowledging the ambivalence of women's positions in patriarchal constellations. I also see this, and perhaps this is even more important, as having significant practical implications for how we build social infrastructures without pushing the responsibility for informal care back onto communities. I'm arguing for the systemic mapping of changing kinship, marriage, and exchange patterns in the development of social infrastructures and interventions that are able to then simultaneously address inequality, mental distress, and patriarchal oppression. Here, we're working towards a redistribution of care burdens across households and communities and changing decision-making structures in households. Now, I've come across some really important precedents for this work. For example, in the work of Buenas Semillas, Women's Circles, an organization that provides psychosocial support groups based on indigenous cosmological principles in Guatemala. In Paula's Courage Plus program, which is a narrative therapy program for improving depression of women experiencing domestic violence in South Africa. And in even closer to my field site, the Buran's community asset model that identifies structures of care that exist within kinship system and layers on top of the investment in mental health support in Uttarakhand in India. So I see these interventions as all sustained by democratic decision-making process and co-production processes that acknowledge the ambivalence of care for the women that they're trying to serve. And I see this as an opening to link to earlier conversations that we've been having here about bottom-up innovation in care provision, about south-to-south learning at the municipal or local level, and towards social infrastructures that revalue the work of care in communities. So we've heard a lot here. I'm going to leave it there and open up for discussion. Thank you so much for your patience with my issues.
Thank you so much, Nikita, and please don't apologize at all. We've certainly had our own issues on this end, so we're grateful for everyone's support, and I'm sure everyone feels the same way. Again, thank you to all our panelists. Brilliant talks. And I'd really like to ask you if you wouldn't mind to turn your cameras on. Thank you to our panelists, please, if they're able to. Are there any questions at all from the group? I mean, Okay, well, as other panelists have said, I'm going to abuse my position then, and I'm just going to dive in. What I thought was really fantastic through all your presentations is that there was really, and I know this was the theme of the panel, but really an effort to rethink where we are, but also that what I felt that you all emphasized and started from was the fact that things have changed. There is a real positive movement towards a recognition of care, and not just within the academy, which obviously we're all living every day, but just more generally than that. And obviously that understanding of the word kikadora, Nadya, was really, that really was transformational. And I think if we all looked at our context, then we would see a similar representation. So could I ask you all maybe to take turns and really reflect on how you see sort of a positive manifestation of this change towards a more recognition of care? Just to name one example of that, because we are coming to the end of our conference, and it might be nice to end on a little note of hope. I'm going to call on Linda first, if you don't mind.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to have a bit of a shout out here for the Women's Budget Group and the Care Recovery Plan post-coronavirus. And perhaps Allison might want to say a little bit about the Ford Foundation recent announcement on resources for care as well in the USA. You're so spot on. There are some green shoots there, but I think it's now up to us to ensure that the Academy can work closely with the policy and political world to move forward in certain debates. So I would just leave it there as my contribution. Much work still to do. Thank you.
Allison, I think Linda tagged you in there.
She did, didn't she? Yeah, Ford did just announce, I did see that, they did just announce a large kind of set aside for issues of kind of care organizing, which I actually appreciated. It wasn't just caregiving, but organizing around issues of care. Here in the US, we are often so anomalous with regard to, the kind of apotheosis of neoliberalism makes it difficult to do a lot of cheering, and we're often I think we're one of two nations that in the world that don't have various kind of basics regarding care infrastructure. But as I'm sure you are all aware, or maybe you're not, we are benefiting right now from a momentary opportunity in the structure in the political opportunity structure, and it's possible that we may have some foundational movement here. I don't want to jinx it by saying it out loud too much, but it does feel like all of a sudden there is recognition that care is a social infrastructure that is crucial and critical. I would argue that it's not just the prior occupant of the White House that has kind of made us all desperate to, or made many desperate to put into force real change, but also actually the pandemic has made the invisibility of care more visible, a little more visible. People are still, of course, behind closed doors laboring, and the kind of tragedy of kind of the disappearance of paid women's paid labor due to caregiving responsibilities has been dramatic and not always as fully recognized as I think it needs to be. But what I see is actually kind of a forging of a kind of the forging of interests that between consumers of care or employers of caregivers and caregiver kind of goals, and that political solidarity has been what has been necessary from the beginning and called for by so many here. So I am hopeful.
I think that's wonderful. And I think that's a great example, Linda, as you say, of engagement between the academy and real practical, because I think Nancy Fulber is really engaged in that Ford program. So, and obviously she's prolific and has been banging this drum for years. So for her to have that concrete change is just amazing. Allison, I think what you say there about the reciprocity of care you know, and that how that understanding is coming to the fore is really hopeful as well. Nikita or Nadya, would you like to say something about maybe a little beacon of hope that you see?
Maybe. I think if we take the perspective from Latin American situation, it's quite interesting because we have been experiencing last years, previously to the pandemic, a growing relevance of care issues and care policies. The experiences of Uruguay in terms of a national integrated care system is really novel for Latin America. Although it could get back from political change, come from political change, it's interesting to see that Argentina is in the same move. And Chile now is in the same move. So it's in a certain extent a little everywhere you are feeling that new institutionalities can be experienced in Latin American countries, even in the really reactionary, difficult, obscurantist, negationist case of Brazilian government. Even in our case, it's quite interesting to recognize that pandemic and all the applause we give to care workers as European and the US people did, the institutions that provide long-term care from their own initiative created a front line that integrate and that articulate their actions with universities. So despite the state, and although we have the repression, there is from bottom up new, very interesting and refreshing experience, even in countries politically so difficult as Brazil is in this moment.
I think that's really important that even within institutions, which we often view as so resistant to change, or even really perpetuating the negativities within the system, that there is change. I mean, my work touches on investment banking, which really we view as a kind of negative monolith quite often. But actually, within investment banking, there is a massive movement towards inclusion. Inclusion of diversity, because and that may be for not maybe the right reasons, in that they recognize that that's a good way to make money, right? Inclusive environments are efficient environments. Nevertheless, it is a signifier of change, you know. Nikita?
Thanks, Claire. And I'm actually going to just pick up on that point that you just made, because I was racking my brains, you know, what is positive going on in India at the moment. It's just a really, really deeply sad situation. And a lot of the amazing work that feminist movements have done over the past decades, you know, is just dissipating. But when I did do my fieldwork, I really saw a movement in the NGO structures, particularly feminist NGO structures, away from individual rights-based models and microfinance-based models of women's empowerment, and towards models of kind of social insurance, or towards social movements that acknowledge, that gave women language to speak about these kind of ambivalences around care without kind of consuming the emic kind of significance and emotional attachments to them. So, I mean, in India, it's definitely from the ground up, not from the top down, but definitely a glimmer of hope there.
Ground up has again been a huge theme throughout. Everyone, you know, has mentioned that, and something I'll touch on a little bit later. But is there anyone else who'd like to ask a burning question? We have a few minutes, or I'm more than happy to invite the panel to ask each other questions or give any burning thoughts. Oh, I see Sebastian has their hand risen. Oh, I've lost the word. Raise their hand. That's the word. If you could unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks to all these wonderful presenters. It was really, really interesting listening to you all. I have a question for, actually, I think it aimed at everybody, but I think it's especially relevant for the first and the second presentation. We're currently developing a national survey in Chile about care within the household as part of the a fund we got from the government to study the effect of COVID and how COVID has sort of stressed the inner functioning of the household and has produced chaotic reconfigurations of care within the households, right? In that sense, I was just listening to what Nadya was mentioning and Nikita as well about these bottom-up initiatives of providing care, right? And I think that's a really wonderful thing to happen, but it's also a really dangerous thing to happen because it kind of put the pressure once again in carers and not in institutions to provide care. And one of the things we have to do with this survey, or that we kind of hope to do, was to inform policymaking to what would it look like for governmental care support. And we've been struggling with that idea because in a way we feel that it sort of freezes care within some individuals, like aiming to help, for instance, women in caring in the household kind of freezes care within that individuals. And it doesn't allow care to be more mobile or like, I don't know how to say it, multi-layer, you know what I mean? So in your experience so far, because I was listening to this multi-systemic ecological approach that you were proposing as well, and Nadya was mentioning about las vecinas and like this kind of expanded notion of care within individuals. What do you think that should look like? How can institutions, governments help further develop care without one, canceling care or like freezing care to just one meaning, and without singling out care to just one person, sort of speaking, you know? That's kind of the question. Thank you so much in advance for any insights.
Thank you, Sebastian. Is there anyone who would like to dive into that? Sophie?
Well, that's a pretty difficult question, and a lot of policy attempts certainly here. You know, things like flexible work have actually done exactly that. It's a woman's problem and it's directed at women. I suppose one way, perhaps I'm just saying this because I've just been thinking about infrastructures of care, might be to think about how infrastructures could be changed to make certain aspects of care easier. I mean, for example, if you take the food thing, I mean, there's lots and lots of work on this sort of thing already, but it would be just about making sure that everybody has enough. It doesn't have to be a woman's job. It's just, you know, we've got to feed the poorest. So you need to start from the position that access to food should be more general. So it doesn't sound really about care, but actually it is.
Okay.
Please,
sorry,
yes, go ahead. No.
Add to that, I was going to say, Sebastian, if you'd like to get in touch after the session, because as Sophie says, it's quite a complex question. But you're so right. If we're not careful, it then drills down to informal care, which really is women's, still sadly configured as women's work. Big debate in the UK about this recently, because the government's hesitating with policy initiatives. And when we had the whole debate around care in the community and the idea that we would encourage people to be more interdependent, that really did result in gendered forms of labour. And sometimes it's just asking people what services they would appreciate, but also perhaps it's using vignettes to encourage people to think about different ways that care could be provided. Because if you don't have a service, sometimes you don't know what you could ask for. So it's the imaginings around care as well. But I think given the time frame, please do get in touch afterwards. And I'm sure Nadya, Nikita and Allison will also have many ideas too. But it sounds a really exciting project, and good luck with that.
Is there anyone else who'd like to say anything burning before we move to the last section?
Just a very, very quick answer to Sebastian's question. One tool I've come across, which I found really fascinating, is the Atlas Care Maps program. It's like a tool that helps you to map. It's a decision-making tool for a family to map care relationships around a certain individual. And what I think is quite important about that is that it allows that process of discussion around care rather than assumption around a certain gendered role. So we've been in our COVID and Care research group, which I'm also a part of, have been in conversations with the UK government's unpaid carers team at the DWP in order to think about what kind of tool could that be, you know, systematically rolled out.
I've actually just put a link to that in the chat, so if anyone is interested. Okay, if there is nothing else, then first of all, I'd like to thank this panel. It was just amazing. There's absolutely no better word, really.